I never thought that people went to buildings. I always saw buildings as stones and decoration and this, but it never occurred to me that people go there. They pray there, they teach there, they talk there, they make deals. I mean, all kinds of things happen in buildings. The contemporary uses of buildings made me try to understand better old buildings. You cannot repaint the Mona Lisa endlessly, and it is no longer the Mona Lisa. So someplace there is an interesting difference between things which are eternally the same, regardless of the time when they are put in the shape in which you see them, and things on the contrary which change all the time, and to which you have to adapt yourself. And this is certainly true with buildings.
He's introduced us to new issues that had not been studied before. He made us look at questions we had not considered before. He made us look at issues in terms of how they affected us. He made us look at meanings, and not just formal compositions. And he made us think of how we relate to our past. You talk about how buildings change. You've gone back again and again to the Dome of the Rock over decades. How has your understanding and appreciation of the building changed, if it has, over those decades?
Absolutely. I mean, my first interpretation of it, which was published in the 50s, a long time ago, was very much a product of the Cold War. That is, I saw this building in terms of the fight between the United States and the Soviet Union, that it was a building in which Muslims and Christians, and this is the Muslim answer, were telling each other how wrong they are and how good we are. And there is no doubt that I saw it as a monument of dynastic power. Then the next time, I got more fascinated, this time not by living people, but by the dead people to the east of it. And I realized that most of the inscriptions talk about paradise, the judgment, the last judgment. You ask that you are there on the threshold of paradise. And it becomes, and because threshold of paradise, this is where the prophet came on his journey to heaven. So it is an eschatological building that prepares you for eternal life, as the whole of Jerusalem is. And then, much later, I realized in my last trips that it also has become a political building. It expresses something of the Palestinian conception of themselves. It's their building. And within the Palestinian world, it has changed very interestingly too. It is mostly used by women for prayer. Men go to the Aqsa Mosque, so that it's not entirely true, but it's so. In other words, it reflects a certain social structure, which before didn't reflect at all. If anybody prayed there before, it didn't matter. Few people prayed. So in other words, what I would say here is that it is a building which I saw first in purely dynastic power play between empires, then in the great medieval, maybe again Muslim and Christian more than Jewish, Muslim and Christian hope for eternal life, that expectation of eternal life and hope for eternal life. After all, for both the Muslims and the Christians, to Muslims, God will come to judge you right there, and Christ will come to judge right there, and it will be done fairly efficiently. And then the third one, it is the politics of today, which gives a different character. But I realized this politicization and reflection of society was always there. We'll give you an interesting example, which I encountered also in Isfahan and in Cairo on other occasions. Whenever you have women meeting in mosques, they usually meet separately from men. And they tell stories. And there is a whole study to be made of what are the stories that women tell each other in holy places. And this, to my knowledge, has never been done. But it is a way in which these buildings reflect needs and hopes and expectations of the contemporary society. It goes together, actually, with other things, both in Damascus and in Jerusalem now. You also have soccer games played in the courtyard of the mosque. I mean, the mosque is a place where you bring your family, your kids, and people play there.
In the 1990s, you wrote the book, The Mediation of Ornament. And that book was not only for the scholars in Islamic architecture or Islamic arts. It was a book which is now like a textbook to many art historians. How do you explain that?
Well, first I would say it didn't happen immediately. It took at least 10 years for it to make any kind of impact, which is also interesting for other reasons. I think that the reason it made an impact is a change in what people expect of works of art and what they want to know about them. People began slowly to realize that the key to their relationship to works of art is the pleasure they obtain in looking at them. It's not that it was done by my grandfather or this was a beautiful house in my country and so forth. It is that they get a pleasure out of it. And there are all kinds of ways of defining that pleasure, but there is a pleasure that is involved. And one of the pleasures of dealing with the work of the Muslim world is what people used to call ornament. Why? Because for a variety of reasons, the Muslim world avoided representational art. I mean, it used it, but it was not as common as in other traditions, and concentrated on other ways of ornamenting or decorating its buildings. And that became geometry, writing, and so forth. And the understanding of that process and of that meaning was something that was quite new. It was something that people had talked about it, but it was new, not only historically, but it was mostly new as an answer to actual emotional, psychological problems people had. Also, on the other hand, it also coincided with an interest in contemporary art, not all contemporary art, in geometry. And I remember very interesting how people used to say, oh, it looks like Escher. And you say, it looks like Escher, that's boo, that's terrible, that's second-rate art. And other people on the kind, it looks like Escher, that's great stuff, wonderful. So in other words, it entered into a scope of contemporary looking at art that was itself divided between what it wanted to do and what it did not want to do. And there it provided some, at least theoretical ground rules on how to deal with it. So I think that was part of its importance. But what the interesting thing about it, it is not a book that has, for instance, been translated into Arabic, Persian, or Turkish. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that it is because its vocabulary is a highly technical vocabulary of Western art and not a vocabulary that is for which you can easily find terms in those languages. But that's something I haven't studied in detail.
Well, in fact, if one looks at that, the record of translation of the various works that you have done, you'll find that there's a different history. For example, the book on the Mosque of Isfahan was translated into Persian actually much more quickly than some of your other works, such as The Formation of Islamic Art or any others. So perhaps looking at the Islamic world as one large entity is not the correct approach, that there are certain areas that would be interested in some aspects and not others.
Well, that's certainly true. But I would add to that there's clearly a Persian interest. Mosque of Isfahan is one of the major monuments of Iran. But similarly, the book I wrote on Persian painting, the early book, was also very rapidly translated into Persian, and now also into Arabic. But that, because there is a public that exists that is interested. Now, I don't think any of them translated my book on the Alhambra into Persian, because that is not part of the what excites the Persian educated classes. So it is the field of ornament is still something that the Muslim world has not completely come to grips with, I think, as to what it means to them. Although this is something I want to, there's no contemporary writing.
No, but this is interesting, and yet the artists, the contemporary artists, and Glenn can probably talk about this as well, are actually completely engaged in actually redefining what it is to react to visual phenomena directly.
Well, maybe the way to ask that question slightly differently is the formation of Islamic art, which is, after all, the text that so many of us who were students of yours, and I suspect students around the world, grew up on as a kind of touchstone for how to think about the Islamic world, posits, by its very definition, the creation of something that we can call Islamic. And I wonder, as you look back today, through the filter and the lens of the present, whether this idea of a synthetic whole notion of an Islamic art is still the right lens, or whether it's a more regional or more specific set of questions that emerge.
Well, there is no doubt that it is the wrong word. It is a word that should be avoided, the word Islamic as an adjective. I mean, but nobody has thought of a better one. So that is right. But because it confuses people. Some people maybe it says religious. Also, while it is true that there is something between Morocco and Malaysia that unites the aesthetic judgment of people, on the whole, Moroccans are much more affected by Spain and Malaysians by China or India than the other. It's partly an artificial political unity that social unity that is created. So the word is a wrong word. What is important is that something happened in this early period that is like an offshoot of something that existed before. It's like a development in the creation of mankind. You suddenly have something new coming out. Now, whether you call it Islamic or something else is another story. Islamic was convenient, but it's a dangerous term because, on the one hand, it implies to the fundamentalist that it is of religious significance and reflects religious needs and so forth. On the other hand, to Westerners, it means all these guys are the same, and we have to put them all in the same pot, both of which are wrong. But that something different happened. I wish I could invent a new word, but I can't.
I want to probe there a little bit and go beyond the sort of superficial side of the distinctions one make in vocabulary to sort of the substance of what's being built today and to the substance of what artists use. In other words, for those of us who thought of an Islamic world as a world that had a shared and common vocabulary that was available to any artist working almost anywhere.
Which, after all, is right what you consider in the mediation of ornament. I mean, that's you posited that there is a shared common vocabulary somehow.
So how does that get reworked in the present? What happens when you interject the now?
This is fascinating, and it fits deeply with the conversation we used to have in Aga Khan committees 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was involved. At that time, our belief was that there was something common, and that we have to define it better, explain it better, and so forth. Now, I would say no. That what is common to the world is not something called Islamic or Christian or Western, or Hollywood. It is a certain cult of wealth. It is a shopping center is universal, just as clothes have become almost the same every place. which is kind of depressing when you think of it. It was so nice when people in different countries had different clothes. I mean, but this is, airplanes are, they try like mad to make one airline different, other by making a different hat on hostess's head. But on the whole, they are the same plane, flown the same way to the same places by the same people, serving the same food and so on. So sameness surrounds us. Now we have little categories in which we keep our pleasure separately. Should this be part of the little category of pleasure, or should we say that art, with the internet, with television and all related activities, all visual forms are going to become universal. There won't be anything national. The local thing is going to be strictly reserved to what I like with my family. I mean, one kind of dessert rather than another kind of dessert. But that there can no longer be a genuine, original local culture. It will be swallowed almost immediately by this universal phenomenon. That therefore, the formation of Islamic art would be a work that tries to explain a period. It is no longer pertinent to today because what the period created died sometime in the 19th century or whatever it is. The mediation of ornament suggests that there is something developed by that first period which is of universal quality, of universal value. But I still remember when that book came out, shortly before it came out, and I had given a talk about it to some of my colleagues at Harvard, and one distinguished colleague told me afterwards, why don't you stick to Arabic and Persian and don't meddle with our world? You see, this is, and it was very interesting because it was, that person felt very strongly that I somehow had passed a border, passed the frontier. I had gone someplace to which I do not belong. I can explain that world to that person, but I have no right to explain her world to her. It happened to be a woman. Her world to her.
But in fact, this is exactly what's happened to our entire field.
The trouble is that we are only beginning to see Western students going east to learn there, rather than Near Eastern students coming west to learn. Eventually, we'll have to have that. We'll have to have these. It exists now a little bit in Turkey and in some other places, but that this kind of great universal university is the kind of thing I would dream of of ours.
That kind of leads to the issue of knowledge formation and knowledge creation. And, you know, a very big part, I think, of the work you did early on when you were part of the Aga Khan Steering Committee was really to think about how to establish the mechanisms by which Muslim societies, wherever they may be, could acquire the knowledge to build and think intelligently about their cities. And you know, is that something that has succeeded? And if it hasn't succeeded, is that something that is still a central issue?
Or it still is a central issue, there is no doubt. But it's a central issue every place. I mean, how to deal with the cities is a central issue. I am not sufficiently up on it to be able to answer whether it is worse, better or not. I mean, I can give examples that I would consider successful, let's say like the redoing of Beirut, for instance. But then a lot of people think it's terrible. I mean, I just don't know. But I would bring something else which is interesting, which is pertinent here. One of the interesting phenomena is the examples we've given so far, all these talks, have been essentially Iran, a little bit of Turkey and the Mediterranean world. Now, there are a whole set of other Muslim worlds that have appeared suddenly. I'm thinking of the Muslim world of Central Asia, which has existed for many years, but is new. We don't know. They have different ideas, different purposes, different functions, different ambitions, aims, and loves, and what have you. There is a Muslim world of the Caucasus, and northern of the Caucasus. I mean, Chechnya is the tragic, but you have the Tatars of the Kazan area, which have the most fascinating architecture, which nobody teaching Islamic architecture has ever heard of. Mosques that look like Orthodox churches. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And now there is a Muslim world in the West, whether it is in Europe or the United States, I mean, which again has its own forms, its own desires, its own ideas, and its own variety. And I think that, in other words, we are dealing with a cauldron of things happening. And I just simply hope that among the next generation there'll be enough bright people who develop great theories to guide the energies, the artistic energies that are involved in all the... Because the energies are enormous. I mean, the exhibition that was at MoMA some years ago was very, very interesting because there were some very wonderful works of art, but the exhibition was very criticized by some people, especially by Muslims, that it didn't reflect the right kind of people. It should have reflected A and not B. So now, this is a silly argument, but it shows that there's an uncertainty as to what is good, what is better, and so forth. That was because I think there is yet not enough writing about it. Now here, I'm going back to my past and my tradition that the drama of today is insufficient writing. People look, people travel, people have meetings, have colloquia, have all kinds of gathering of one kind or another. But writing of books with theories behind them and practice is too little, and there should be one a week, because there is so much to be said and so much to be and that doesn't happen enough.
Thank you, Professor Grabar. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Renata, and thank you all for being here.